The first sign that something was wrong appeared just after sunrise, when the quiet order of Maple Ridge Estates shattered beneath the harsh glint of steel. At the edge of the private access road leading up the hill, where the asphalt curved between manicured hedges and oversized stone mailboxes, a jagged strip of metal lay stretched across the pavement like a trap set for prey. Rows of sharpened spikes pointed upward, cold and deliberate, waiting for the first unsuspecting set of tires to roll over them. In most neighborhoods, it would have looked like an act of vandalism. In Maple Ridge Estates, it looked like policy. The Homeowners Association had spent years building a reputation that balanced on the edge of order and intimidation. The place was less a neighborhood and more a kingdom ruled by petty authority, where every blade of grass, every paint color, every parked vehicle was watched with obsessive scrutiny. At the center of it all stood the HOA president, Cynthia Holloway, a woman whose need for control had long since crossed the line from administration into obsession. She had made herself feared. Fines appeared in mailboxes for trash bins left visible for more than 10 minutes after pickup. Warning letters arrived over flower beds that didn't match the approved landscaping palette. Guests' cars were towed in the middle of the night for parking slightly over painted guest space lines. Her reign was built on conflict, and conflict was exactly what kept her in power. But this morning, Cynthia had taken things further than anyone imagined. The spike strip had not been placed on a common entrance. It had been laid across the private road leading to the Ridge property at the very top of the estate. That road belonged to Sheriff Daniel Mercer. Daniel's house stood apart from the rest of the subdivision, a sprawling ranch-style estate surrounded by oak trees and old fencing that had existed long before Maple Ridge Estates was ever built. His land had been there first, grandfathered into the development contract decades earlier. When the subdivision expanded, developers had built the neighborhood around his property, leaving one legal access road that remained solely under his ownership. Everyone in the HOA knew it, or at least they should have. For months, tension had been building between Daniel and Cynthia. She had repeatedly attempted to claim authority over his road, insisting it fell under community traffic management regulations. Daniel had answered every notice with the same calm, documented refusal, backed by land surveys, county filings, and property deeds that left no room for interpretation. The road was his. The law was clear. But Cynthia was not interested in law. She was interested in winning. From the window of his black county-issued SUV, Daniel stared at the steel trap blocking his path. Morning light caught the badge pinned to his chest. As he stepped out, boots crunching against the gravel shoulder, the sight before him stirred something deep and dangerous. Not anger. Not yet. Something colder. The kind of stillness that came before a storm. The sheriff had seen this sort of thing before, though never in his own driveway. He had spent 20 years dealing with territorial disputes, boundary conflicts, and power-hungry local officials who mistook position for ownership. But this was different. This was personal. The spike strip had been placed less than 30 feet from the boundary marker, clearly engraved with his parcel number. Someone had made a choice. Someone had crossed a line. Daniel crouched beside the metal strip, studying it with the sharp eye of a lawman. It was not makeshift. It was professionally manufactured, the kind law enforcement agencies used for vehicle interdictions. That realization sent a darker suspicion through him. Someone had either purchased police-grade equipment illegally or used access through private security contractors. Either way, it was no longer just an HOA issue. It was evidence. Across the road, behind a curtain of lace blinds, several neighbors watched from their windows. Maple Ridge residents had become accustomed to conflict, but even for them this was different. Whispers had already begun to spread from house to house like wildfire. Cynthia had finally gone too far. Daniel straightened and looked down the slope toward the clubhouse at the center of the subdivision. Even from here, he could see movement near the front entrance. Board members gathering, security personnel pacing. Cynthia herself standing near the stone fountain in a cream blazer, arms folded like a general overseeing a battlefield. She knew exactly what she had done, and she was waiting for him to react. For Cynthia Holloway, conflict was theater. She fed on spectacle. What she did not know, what none of them seemed to understand, was that Daniel Mercer was not merely another homeowner to intimidate with legal threats and community bylaws. He was the elected sheriff of the county. The badge on his chest carried more weight than every HOA regulation binder stacked in the clubhouse office. For months he had tolerated the harassment because he refused to abuse his office in a personal dispute. He had answered her notices as a private citizen, respecting the separation between public authority and private life. But the spike strip changed everything, because this was no longer a disagreement over landscaping codes or easement language. This was reckless endangerment, potential criminal mischief, obstruction of a lawful access road. And if a resident or emergency vehicle had hit it, the consequences could have been catastrophic. Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, photographing the strip from multiple angles, including the HOA branded maintenance truck parked halfway down the hill. A mistake. A very expensive mistake. The logo on the truck door gleamed in the morning light like a confession. As he documented the scene, more residents began to gather along the sidewalks. Some came out in bathrobes and slippers, others in exercise clothes halfway through morning walks, all drawn by the promise of drama. Maple Ridge thrived on drama, and today, it had found its headline. Daniel could feel their eyes on him, waiting to see whether he would erupt. But Daniel Mercer was not a man ruled by impulse. He was a man who built cases. Every detail mattered. Every step mattered. And somewhere behind those clubhouse walls, Cynthia Holloway believed she had cornered him. She believed she had forced him into a fight on her terms. She had no idea that by sunrise tomorrow, the fight would no longer belong to the HOA. It would belong to the sheriff's office, as Daniel placed a call to dispatch and requested a deputy unit for an official property obstruction report. A ripple of unease moved through the watching crowd. The reality of what had happened was beginning to settle over the neighborhood. This was no longer gossip. This was an investigation. And high above the road, from the stone balcony of the clubhouse, Cynthia watched with the faintest smile on her lips, unaware that the first crack in her carefully controlled empire had already begun to spread. By nightfall, Maple Ridge Estates would not be talking about landscaping violations or parking fines. They would be talking about police tape, and the road war had only just begun. By mid-morning, Maple Ridge Estates no longer felt like a quiet suburban enclave. It felt like a pressure cooker with the lid lifted just enough for steam to escape in uneasy bursts. Residents moved through their routines with forced normalcy, but every glance toward the Ridge Road carried the same unspoken question of how far things would escalate before something broke. Down at the base of the hill, county response vehicles arrived without sirens. That silence alone signaled seriousness. 2 uniformed deputies stepped out, followed by a transport officer responsible for documenting roadway hazards. Their presence turned the spike strip from a neighborhood controversy into an official incident scene. Yellow tape went up quickly, cutting across the private road in a clean diagonal line. The sharp metal spikes were photographed, measured, and logged with mechanical precision. The HOA maintenance truck parked nearby was inspected without hesitation, its tires, its cargo bed, and its GPS history quietly pulled into the growing file. Daniel Mercer stood slightly apart from the activity, observing without interference. He had shifted fully into his role now, no longer a homeowner, but a law enforcement officer overseeing an unfolding investigation that had personal roots but public consequences. That distinction mattered. It kept his decisions clean. What troubled him more than the spike strip itself was the intent behind it. This was not improvisation. It was not a prank. It was deliberate, premeditated obstruction placed on a road that, according to county records, the HOA had no legal authority to modify or restrict. That made it more than a dispute. It made it a violation of jurisdictional boundaries. As one deputy compiled statements from nearby residents, a pattern began to emerge. Multiple homeowners had received vague notices from the HOA in recent weeks referencing road access compliance enforcement, despite no legal backing for such enforcement. Several mentioned fines for unauthorized vehicle passage near the ridge line. It was as if Cynthia Holloway had been slowly building a false authority framework, one letter at a time, hoping repetition would replace legality. The paper trail was beginning to reveal itself. Inside the clubhouse, the HOA board convened in emergency session. The building, usually a place for curated community events and polite financial discussions, now felt suffocating. Cynthia controlled the room with practiced stillness, but even her closest allies seemed uncertain. The presence of law enforcement outside the gates had shifted the balance of power in ways no one had prepared for. Still, Cynthia did not retreat. Instead, she doubled down on documentation of her own. She produced printed binders of community safety policies, most of them loosely referencing generic municipal traffic codes that did not apply to private roads under county sheriff jurisdiction. The language was dense enough to confuse casual readers, but hollow under legal scrutiny. Her strategy had always been the same: overwhelm with paperwork until resistance collapsed under exhaustion. But this time, the opposition was not a homeowner. It was the county itself. Outside, Daniel reviewed the compiled evidence. The spike strip had been purchased through a private security distributor registered under a subcontractor tied loosely to HOA maintenance contracts. The purchase order was vague, labeled under traffic control equipment, but it still left a digital trail. That trail led back through billing approvals, and those approvals bore HOA executive authorization signatures. The implication was no longer subtle. This was not rogue maintenance. This was sanctioned action from within the HOA leadership structure. A deputy approached Daniel with a preliminary assessment. The obstruction qualified as unlawful interference with an ingress route, potentially escalating to criminal mischief depending on intent confirmation. The word, intent, hung in the air like a loaded question. Daniel already knew the answer. Intent had been written across every prior interaction with Cynthia Holloway. The fines, the threats, the manufactured authority, the gradual tightening of control over land she did not own. The spike strip was not an isolated incident. It was the endpoint of a strategy. As the morning stretched into afternoon, more residents gathered at a distance, forming clusters along sidewalks and driveways. Phones recorded everything. Rumors multiplied faster than facts. Some defended Cynthia out of habit. Others condemned her out of long-standing frustration. The neighborhood was splitting into factions. But beneath all of it, a deeper realization was spreading. The HOA had overreached, not just socially, legally. And for the first time in years, Maple Ridge Estates was being seen not as a self-regulating community, but as a potential liability. By the time the sun began to tilt westward, the investigation had expanded beyond a single spike strip. County records were being pulled. HOA financial transactions were under review. Communication logs were being subpoenaed. Daniel watched it unfold with the steady patience of someone who understood how systems collapsed. Not all at once, but through a sequence of irreversible confirmations. And somewhere above it all, in the glass-walled clubhouse office, Cynthia continued sorting documents, convinced she was still in control of the narrative. She had not yet realized the narrative had already left her hands. It was now in the hands of the county, and the next move would not be hers to make. By late afternoon, Maple Ridge Estates had transformed into something unrecognizable from its carefully curated image. The trimmed hedges and polished driveways remained untouched, but the atmosphere had shifted into something heavier, like a storm that refused to break yet refused to leave. County investigators moved through the HOA clubhouse with quiet efficiency. Files were no longer being arranged, they were being removed. Boxes labeled Community Enforcement Records were stacked near the entrance, each one sealed and tagged for audit. What had once been presented as harmless administrative governance was now being dismantled document by document. Cynthia Holloway observed the process from her office window, her posture rigid, her expression carefully controlled. She had built her authority on paperwork, on procedure, on the illusion that repeated documentation created legitimacy. Watching those same documents being boxed up felt like watching the foundation of her influence being quietly excavated. Outside, Daniel Mercer stood near the entrance path, speaking with the lead investigator. The conversation was measured, professional, and increasingly conclusive. The spike strip incident was no longer viewed as an isolated overreach. It was being interpreted as part of a pattern of unauthorized enforcement actions initiated by HOA leadership. That classification changed everything. What had started as a neighborhood dispute was now being evaluated under potential misuse of quasi-governmental authority. Inside Maple Ridge Estates, HOA leadership had long acted as if their rules carried the weight of law. In practice, they did not. But perception had been enough for years. People complied because resistance was expensive, time-consuming, and socially uncomfortable. Cynthia had built her entire system on that inertia. Now, inertia was collapsing. As afternoon shadows stretched across the clubhouse courtyard, residents were no longer just watching. They were participating. Statements were being collected from homeowners who had previously remained silent. Stories of fines without legal basis, of restricted access to common areas, of intimidation over minor violations. All of it was beginning to surface under formal questioning. Each testimony added another layer to the investigation. Each layer made denial harder. Daniel reviewed a preliminary timeline forming on a digital report screen. It showed a gradual escalation of HOA enforcement activity over the past several months, coinciding with Cynthia Holloway's consolidation of board control. What stood out was not just the spike strip incident, but the normalization of unauthorized authority leading up to it. This was not sudden misconduct. It was structured escalation, and structures like that rarely formed alone. By early evening, county officials requested access to the HOA's digital record system. The request was not framed as optional. Cynthia's administrative privileges were suspended pending review. The system that had once allowed her to issue fines and send violation notices was now locked behind a county-controlled firewall. For the first time in years, she could not enforce anything. The silence of that realization was heavier than any confrontation. Inside the clubhouse, board members began to fracture. Some attempted to distance themselves from prior decisions, insisting they had merely followed procedural guidance. Others grew defensive, clinging to the belief that everything had been within community rights. But the structure they had relied on was no longer stable enough to support collective denial. Outside, residents began to gather in larger numbers, no longer just observers but witnesses to a shift in power. The spike strip remained sealed behind yellow tape, but it had become symbolic of something larger, proof that the HOA's authority had crossed a boundary it could not defend. Daniel received a final update from the lead investigator just before sunset. The case was now officially classified as unauthorized obstruction of a public access route under color of private authority. Additional charges remained under review depending on financial and administrative findings. In simpler terms, the HOA had acted like a governing body without legal standing, and someone would be held accountable for it. As daylight faded, Cynthia finally stepped out of the clubhouse for the first time since the investigation began. She moved slowly, no longer carrying the same commanding presence. The courtyard lights reflected off polished stone beneath her feet, but the glow no longer felt like authority. It felt like exposure. Across the distance, Daniel watched without expression. He had seen this moment before in different forms, people realizing too late that control built on assumption always collapsed under scrutiny. But this time, it was not a single individual facing consequences. It was an entire system, and Maple Ridge Estates was about to learn how quickly a system could be rewritten when it was never legally valid to begin with. As night settled over the neighborhood, the spike strip remained where it had been placed, no longer a tool of enforcement, but evidence of overreach. And in the quiet that followed, the real consequences began to form. Night had fully settled over Maple Ridge Estates, but the neighborhood did not return to normal. Light stayed on longer than usual in living rooms that usually went dark after dinner. Curtains shifted more than they closed. Conversations were quieter, but sharper. The entire community had entered a state of suspended anticipation, as if everyone understood that something irreversible had already been set in motion. At the center of it all, the HOA clubhouse remained lit like a stage after the audience has left, with only the aftermath still being examined. Inside, county officials continued their review under artificial lighting. The tone had shifted from investigation to reconstruction. They were no longer just collecting evidence, they were rebuilding the sequence of decisions that led to it. Each document pulled from the HOA system revealed another layer of overreach disguised as community governance. Financial records showed unexpected expenditures labeled under vague categories like security enhancement and traffic compliance enforcement. None of these expenses had proper county authorization. Several required board approval signatures that, under closer inspection, appeared to have been applied under procedural pressure rather than unanimous consent. Cynthia Holloway's influence was still visible everywhere, but it was beginning to look less like leadership and more like accumulation. Outside, Daniel Mercer remained on site, his presence steady, detached from the internal chaos of the HOA office. He had transitioned fully into oversight mode, allowing the county team to operate independently while he focused on ensuring jurisdictional clarity was maintained. The distinction mattered more now than ever. This was no longer about one incident. It was about how far a private association could stretch the illusion of authority before it snapped. At around 9 p.m., a formal notice arrived from the county legal division. It suspended all enforcement activities by the HOA pending full compliance review. That included issuing fines restricting access or implementing any form of roadway control measures. The language was precise, unmistakable, absolute. For Maple Ridge Estates, it meant that overnight, the HOA had lost the ability to enforce anything it had spent years building its identity around. Inside the clubhouse, the board reacted in fragmented ways. Some members expressed shock, as if they had not participated in the system they were now seeing dismantled. Others fell into defensive justification, clinging to interpretations of bylaws that no longer held legal weight. But none of it mattered anymore. The structure had already been suspended. Cynthia remained largely silent throughout the night proceedings. She moved through the office with controlled, deliberate steps, reviewing printed copies of documents as if repetition could restore legitimacy. But every page she turned was already being mirrored in county systems, annotated with legal notes that reframed her actions in ways she had not anticipated. What had once been administrative confidence was turning into procedural exposure. Outside, residents began to gather in small groups again, no longer out of curiosity but out of uncertainty. The Spike Strip incident had become a focal point, but it was no longer the only concern. People were beginning to ask how many other decisions had been made without proper authority, how many fines had been enforced under assumptions rather than law. The trust that held the neighborhood together was unraveling faster than anyone expected. By midnight, Daniel received a private update from the county legal supervisor. The investigation had expanded to include potential abuse of authority under private governance structures, as well as unauthorized representation of regulatory power. It was not yet criminal prosecution, but it was approaching that threshold. The language used was careful, but the implication was not. If confirmed, the HOA leadership would not simply be corrected. It would be held accountable. As Daniel stepped outside the clubhouse for a moment of quiet, he looked up the hill toward the Ridge Road. The spike strip was still there, now covered with a protective marker and evidence tags. What had been meant as a barrier had become a symbol of collapse. Not physical collapse, institutional collapse. From behind the glass, he could see Cynthia still inside, framed by office light, surrounded by documents that no longer carried power. For the first time, her environment no longer reflected control, it reflected containment. And in Maple Ridge Estates, containment was a concept no one had expected to apply to the HOA itself. The night stretched on, but the outcome was already beginning to settle. Authority had been questioned, and once that happened, it rarely returned in the same form again. By early morning, Maple Ridge Estates no longer felt like a neighborhood under tension. It felt like a place under supervision. County presence had increased overnight, not with sirens or spectacle, but with quiet administrative precision. Additional vehicles arrived before sunrise, carrying audit teams, legal advisors, and compliance officers whose work did not involve confrontation, only confirmation. Inside the HOA clubhouse, the tone had shifted again. What had begun as an investigation was now a formal administrative takeover of records and authority review. Every system the HOA had used to regulate residents was now mirrored, monitored, and cross-checked against county standards. The illusion of independent enforcement had been fully dismantled. Cynthia Holloway had not left the building since the previous night. She remained inside her office, surrounded by binders that no longer represented power but history. The documents she had once used to issue fines and enforce compliance now sat in stacks marked for audit retention. Each page was being reviewed not for validation but for legality. The distinction mattered, and it was widening with every passing hour. Outside, Daniel Mercer stood near the Ridge Road again. The spike strip area had been fully secured, now surrounded by temporary barriers and evidence markers. What once had been a tool of intimidation had become the central artifact of a broader investigation. Technicians photographed the terrain, measured placement angles, and documented how deliberately it had been positioned to obstruct a legally owned access route. The conclusion forming in the official record was becoming increasingly unavoidable. This had not been a misunderstanding. It had been an assertion of authority where none existed. By mid-morning, County Legal Counsel delivered an interim ruling to the HOA board. The organization was required to immediately suspend all regulatory functions pending structural review. That meant no enforcement actions, no fines, no access restrictions, and no representation of authority over roadway access or property compliance. The wording was deliberate, but the effect was immediate. The HOA had not been reformed. It had been paused. And in legal terms, pause often precedes reconstruction. Inside the clubhouse, the board members reacted in varying degrees of disbelief and concern. Some attempted to salvage procedural legitimacy by offering revisions to bylaws. Others tried to argue historical precedent. But none of it carried weight against the county's jurisdictional findings. What had once been treated as community governance was now being reclassified as administrative overreach, operating without enforceable legal backing. Cynthia finally emerged from her office just after noon. Her presence, once commanding, now felt contained within the structure itself. She moved through the hallway slowly, passing rooms where county staff were cataloging years of records. No one interrupted her, and no one followed. The shift in authority was no longer symbolic. It was procedural. Outside, residents gathered again, but this time the energy was different. There was no curiosity left, only realization. The HOA had not simply made a mistake. It had operated beyond its legal boundaries for long enough that enforcement had become normalized. That normalization was now collapsing under review. Daniel received confirmation from the county supervisor that preliminary findings supported escalation into formal corrective action proceedings. That meant accountability would not remain internal to the HOA structure. It would extend into official documentation, potential penalties, and permanent restriction of enforcement authority. The system that had once intimidated residents into compliance was now being turned back onto itself. As afternoon settled over Maple Ridge Estates, the symbolic weight of the spike strip changed once again. It was no longer just evidence of misconduct. It had become the reference point for a larger realization authority had been assumed, not granted. And assumptions, once challenged by law, rarely survived intact. From a distance, Daniel observed the clubhouse one more time. Inside, the same building that had once projected control was now functioning as a collection point for its own dismantling. No confrontation, no chaos, just reversal. And in that reversal, the true structure of power in Maple Ridge Estates was finally being revealed. By the final morning of the investigation cycle, Maple Ridge Estates no longer resembled the tightly controlled community it once pretended to be. The illusion had dissolved completely. What remained was a neighborhood adjusting, slowly and awkwardly, to the absence of a self-appointed authority that had governed far more than it was ever legally allowed to. The HOA clubhouse, once a symbol of order and exclusivity, now functioned as a temporary administrative processing site under county oversight. Tables that had once hosted polished community meetings were covered in evidence logs, financial records, and compliance reports. The same space where fines had been authorized and disputes arbitrated was now being used to document how those processes had overstepped legal boundaries for months, possibly years. Cynthia Holloway remained inside under formal administrative restriction, not as a criminal in custody, but as a figure under full governance suspension review. Her authority had been completely stripped in practice, even if the final legal classification was still being finalized. What mattered now was no longer influence, but accountability. Outside, the Ridge Road stood quiet. The spike strip had been removed the previous evening, not as an act of concealment, but as official evidence processing completion. The asphalt where it had once been placed now carried faint markings from documentation, spray paint, and measurement chalk. What had once been an instrument of intimidation had been reduced to a recorded event in a case file. Daniel Mercer stood at the edge of the road one last time, watching as county vehicles prepared to leave the immediate site. His role in the situation had shifted over the past days from resident to witness to overseeing authority presence, and now finally back to a position of distance. The investigation was no longer unfolding. It had concluded in its primary phase. What remained was consequence. The final county report summarized the findings with clinical clarity. The HOA had engaged in unauthorized enforcement activity, misrepresented regulatory authority, and implemented physical road obstructions without legal jurisdiction. The spike strip incident had been classified as a critical escalation point, but not an isolated one. It was the visible endpoint of a pattern that had been building through procedural overreach. The ruling was not dramatic, it was structural. The HOA's enforcement powers were permanently revoked pending full reformation under county-approved governance guidelines. Any future authority would require legal restructuring, resident consent under verified statutes, and direct oversight compliance. In practical terms, the HOA that had existed before this incident was gone. Not reformed, not corrected, replaced in function by oversight. As morning moved into midday, residents began returning to their routines cautiously, almost uncertainly. The absence of constant violation notices, patrol-like inspections, and sudden fines created a strange silence in the community. Some felt relief. Others felt disorientation. A few felt something closer to disbelief, as if years of structured pressure had simply been lifted without warning. The psychological shift was just beginning. At the clubhouse, the final administrative handover took place quietly. Files were sealed, systems were locked, and access credentials were transferred to county governance control. There was no confrontation during the process, no final speech, no dramatic exit, only completion. Cynthia left the building later that afternoon without ceremony. There were no crowds, no reactions, no remaining authority to assert. The structure she had built no longer recognized her control, and the neighborhood that once responded to her influence now simply observed her departure as part of the resolution, not the conflict. Daniel watched from a distance but did not intervene. This was no longer a law enforcement moment. It was the end state of an overextended system correcting itself through legal structure rather than force. By evening, Maple Ridge Estates had begun to settle into a new normal, though no one yet knew what that normal would fully become. The fences remained, the homes remained, the streets remained, but the invisible hierarchy that once dictated daily life had been erased. And in its place, something quieter had emerged: accountability without spectacle, authority without assumption, and a community that had finally learned where its boundaries actually were. The spike strip was gone, but its lesson remained.